I observed a very large sperm whale, about 85 feet in length. He broke water 20 rods off our weather bow and was lying quietly with his head in a direction for the ship. He spouted 2 or 3 times and disappeared. In less than 3 seconds, he came up again and made directly for us. I stood watching his movements coming down for us with great celerity. I ordered the boy at the helm to put it hard up, intending to sheer off and avoid him. The words were scarcely out of my mouth before he came down upon us with full speed and struck the ship with his head. He gave us such an appalling and tremendous jar as nearly threw us all on our faces. The ship brought up as suddenly and violently as if she had struck a rock and trembled for a few seconds like a leaf. We looked at each other with perfect amazement, deprived almost of the power of speech. He was enveloped in the foam of the sea that his continual and violent thrashing about in the water had created around him, and I could distinctly see him smite his jaws together, as if distracted with rage and fury. He remained a short time in this situation, and then started off with great velocity across the bows of the ship. By this time, the ship had settled down a considerable distance in the water, and I gave her up as lost. I was aroused with the cry of a man at the hatchway. "Here he is. He's making for us again." I turned around and saw him directly ahead of us, coming down with twice his ordinary speed, and at that moment it appeared with tenfold fury and vengeance. The surf flew in all directions about him, and his course towards us was marked by a white foam, which he made with the continual violent thrashing of his tail. His head was about half out of the water, and I bawled out to the helmsman, "Hard up," but she had not fallen off more than a point before she took the second shock. He struck her directly under the cathead and completely stove in her bows. He passed under the ship again, and we saw no more of him. We were more than 1,000 miles from the nearest land, and with nothing but a light, open boat as the resource of safety for myself and companions. I cut away the lashings of the spare boat and cried out to those near me to take her as she came down. The steward had, in the meantime, gone down into the cabin twice and saved 2 quadrants, 2 practical navigators, and the captain's trunk and mine, all which were hastily thrown into the boat as she lay on the deck with the 2 compasses which I snatched from the binnacle. We were scarcely 2 boats' length from her when she fell over and settled down into the water. Amazement and despair now wholly took possession of us. We contemplated the frightful situation the ship lay in and thought with horror upon the sudden and dreadful calamity that had overtaken us. The crew of the ship were saved, consisting of 20 human souls. All that remained to conduct these 20 beings through the stormy terrors of the ocean, perhaps many thousand miles, were 3 open, light boats. The other 2 boats kept up the pursuit and soon struck another whale, they being at this time a considerable distance to leeward. We lay at this time in our boat, about 2 ship lengths off from the wreck, in perfect silence, calmly contemplating her situation, when the other boats were discovered rowing up to us. The sudden and mysterious disappearance of the ship was first discovered by the boat steerer in the captain's boat, and with a horror-struck countenance and voice, he suddenly exclaimed, "Oh my God! Where's the ship?" The captain's boat was the first that reached us. "My God, Mr. Chase, what is the matter?" I answered, "We have been stove by a whale." I then briefly told him the story, and after a few moments' reflection he observed that we must cut away her masts and endeavor to get something out of her to eat. We now commenced to cut a hole through the planks directly above 2 large casks of bread, which most fortunately were between decks, and we had strong hopes was not wet. It turned out according to our wishes, and from these casks we obtained 600 pounds of hard bread. Other parts of the deck were then scuttled, and we got without difficulty as much fresh water as we dared to take in the boats, so that each was supplied with about 65 gallons. We got also a musket, a small canister of powder, a couple of files, 2 rasps, 2 pounds of boat nails, and a few turtles. Having obtained everything that occurred to us could then be got out, we began to make arrangements for our safety during the night. The scenes of yesterday passed in such quick succession in my mind that it was not until after many hours of severe reflection that I was able to discard the idea of the catastrophe as a dream. Alas, it was one from which there was no awakening. The morning dawned upon our wretched company. At sunrise, we began to think of doing something. What, we did not know. We cast our loose boats and visited the wreck to see if anything more of consequence could be preserved. But everything looked cheerless and desolate. All set to work in stripping off the light sails of the ship for sails to our boats. Each boat was rigged with 2 masts to carry a flying jib and 2 sprit sails. We procured from the wreck some light cedar boards, with which we built up additional sides, about 6 inches above the gunwale. Our provisions were scarcely touched. The appetite was entirely gone. But as we had a great abundance of water, we indulged in frequent and copious draughts, which our parched mouths seemed continually to need. None asked for bread. We examined our navigators to ascertain the nearest land, and found it was the Marquesas Islands. The Society Islands were next. These islands we were entirely ignorant of. If inhabited, we presumed they were by savages, from whom we had as much to fear as from the elements, or even death itself. We had no charts from which our calculations might be aided, and were consequently obliged to govern ourselves by the navigators alone. It would be most advisable to shape our course by the wind to the southward, fall in with the variable winds, and then endeavor to get eastward to the coast of Chile or Peru. Accordingly, preparations were made for our immediate departure. The boat which it was my rather misfortune to have was the worst of the 3. She was old and patched up, having been stove a number of times during the cruise. At best, a whaleboat is an extremely frail thing, the most so of any other kind of boat. In consideration of my having the weakest boat, 6 men were allotted to it, while those of the captain and second mate took 7 each. And at 12:30 we left the wreck, steering our course with nearly all sail set. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, we lost sight of her entirely. Many were the lingering and sorrowful looks we cast behind us. We conceived that our provision and water, on a small allowance, would last us 60 days. That with the trade wind, on the course we were then lying, we should be able to average the distance of a degree a day, which in 26 days would enable us to attain the region of the variable winds, and then in 30 more, at the very utmost, we might reach the coast. With these considerations, we commenced our voyage. Our allowance of provision at first consisted of 1 biscuit, weighing about 1 pound 3 ounces, and half a pint of water a day for each man. This small quantity, less than 1/3 which is required by an ordinary person, we took without murmuring, and on many an occasion afterwards blessed God that even this pittance was allowed to us in our misery. November 24th. The wind had not abated any since the preceding day, and the sea had risen to be very large, and increased, if possible, the extreme uncomfortableness of our situation. What added more than anything else to our misfortunes was that all our efforts for the preservation of our provisions proved, in a great measure, ineffectual. A heavy sea broke suddenly into the boat, and before we could snatch it up, damaged some part of it. By timely attention, however, and great caution, we managed to make it eatable and to preserve the rest from a similar casualty. We ascertained the next day that some of the provisions in the captain boat had shared a similar fate during the night. Both accidents served to arouse us to a still stronger sense of our slender reliance upon the human means at our command, and to show us our utter dependence on that divine aid which we so much the more stood in need of. November 25th. About 8 o'clock in the morning we discovered that the water began to come fast in our boat, and in a few minutes the quantity increased to such a degree as to alarm us considerably for our safety. We found it proceeded from one of the streaks or outside boards having bursted off there. The great difficulty consisted in its being in the bottom of the boat, about 6 inches from the surface of the water. After directing all the men in the boat to get on one side, the other by that means heeled out of the water a considerable distance, and with a little difficulty, we then managed to drive in a few nails and secured it, much beyond our expectations. Fears of no ordinary kind were excited by this seemingly small accident. The progress of our voyage would serve but to increase the incapacity and weakness of our boat, and the starting of a single nail in her bottom would most assuredly prove our certain destruction. November 28th. The night set in extremely dark and tempestuous, and we began to entertain fears that we should be separated. At about 11 o'clock at night, having laid down to sleep, I was suddenly awakened by one of my companions, who cried out that the captain was in distress and was calling on us for assistance. I made all haste to put about, ran down to him, and inquired what was the matter. He replied, "I have been attacked by an unknown fish, and he has stove my boat." It appeared that some large fish had accompanied the boat for a short distance and had suddenly made an unprovoked attack upon her with his jaws. The extreme darkness of the night prevented them from distinguishing what kind of animal it was, but they judged it about 12 feet in length and one of the killer fish species. After having struck the boat once, he continued to play about her on every side, as if manifesting a disposition to renew the attack, and did a second time strike the bows of the boat and split her stem. They had no other instrument of offense but the sprit pole, a long, slender piece of wood by which the peak of the sail is extended, with which, after repeated attempts to destroy the boat, they succeeded in beating him off. I arrived just as he discontinued his operations and disappeared. He had made a considerable breach in the bows of the boat, through which the water had began to pour fast, and the captain immediately took measures to remove his provisions into the second mate's boat and mine, in order to lighten his own, and by that means, and constant bailing, to keep her above water until daylight should enable him to discover the extent of the damage and to repair it. The night was spissy darkness itself. We were not without our fears that the fish might renew his attack sometime during the night upon one of the other boats and unexpectedly destroy us. When daylight came, we all lay to repair the broken boat, which was effected by nailing on thin strips of boards on the inside, and having replaced the provisions, we proceeded again on our course. Our allowance of water became now to be insufficient, and we began to experience violent thirst from the consumption of the provisions that had been wet with the salt water and dried in the sun. Of these we were obliged to eat first, to prevent their spoiling, and we could not, nay, we did not, dare to make any encroachments on our stock of water. Our determination was to suffer as long as human patience and endurance would hold out. November 30th. This was a remarkably fine day. At 1 o'clock, I proposed to our boat's crew to kill one of the turtle, 2 of which we had in our possession. I need not say that the proposition was hailed with the utmost enthusiasm. Hunger had set its ravenous gnawings upon our stomachs, and we waited with impatience to suck the warm, flowing blood of the animal. A small fire was kindled in the shell of the turtle, and after dividing the blood, we cooked the remainder, entrails and all, and enjoyed from it an unspeakably fine repast. The stomachs of 2 or 3 revolted at the sight of the blood and refused to partake of it. Not even the outrageous thirst that was upon them could induce them to taste it. For myself, I took it like a medicine, to relieve the extreme dryness of my palate, and stopped not to inquire whether it was anything else than a liquid. After this, I may say, exquisite banquet, our bodies were considerably recruited, and I felt my spirits now much higher than they had been at any time before. Our distance from the wreck, as nearly as we could calculate, was then about 480 miles. December 3rd. With great joy, we hailed the last crumb of our damaged bread and commenced this day to take our allowance of healthy provisions. Gradually, as we partook of our small allowance of water, the moisture began to collect in our mouths, and the parching fever of the palate imperceptibly left it. An accident here happened to us, which gave us a great momentary spell of uneasiness. The night was dark and the sky was completely overcast, so that we could scarcely discern each other's boats, when at about 10 o'clock that of the second mate was suddenly missing. I felt for a moment considerable alarm at her unexpected disappearance. I immediately hove to, struck a light as expeditiously as possible, and hoisted it at the masthead in a lantern. Our eyes were now directed over every part of the ocean in search of her, when to our great joy, we discerned an answering light about a quarter of a mile to leeward of us, and it proved to be the lost boat. It is truly remarked that misfortune more than anything else serves to endear us to our companions. So strongly was this sentiment engrafted upon our feelings, and so closely were the destinies of all of us involuntarily linked together, that had one of the boats been wrecked and wholly lost with all her provisions and water, we should have felt ourselves constrained, by every tie of humanity, to have taken the surviving sufferers into the other boats and shared our bread and water with them, while a crumb of one or a drop of the other remained. Subsequently, however, our situation became more straitened and desperate. Our conversation on the subject took a different turn, and it appeared to be a universal sentiment that such a course of conduct was calculated to weaken the chances of a final deliverance for some, and might be the only means of consigning every soul of us to a horrid death of starvation. There is no question but that an immediate separation, therefore, was the most politic measure that could be adopted. On the 5th of December at night, owing to the extreme darkness and a strong wind, I again separated from the other boats. Finding they were not to be seen in any direction, I loaded my pistol and fired it twice. Soon after the second discharge, they made their appearance a short distance to windward, and we joined the company and again kept on our course. While standing on our course this day, we came across a small shoal of flying fish, 4 of which, in their efforts to avoid us, flew against the mainsail and dropped into the boat. One having fell near me, I eagerly snatched it up and devoured. The other 3 were immediately taken by the rest and eaten alive. For the first time, I, on this occasion, felt the disposition to laugh, upon witnessing the ludicrous and almost desperate efforts of my 5 companions, who each sought to get a fish. The hot rays of the sun beat down upon us to such a degree as to oblige us to hang over the gunwale of the boat into the sea to cool our weak and fainting bodies. No sooner had one of us got on the outside of the gunwale than he immediately observed the bottom of the boat to be covered with a species of small clam, which upon being tasted proved a most delicious and agreeable food. This was no sooner announced to us than we commenced to tear them off and eat them, for a few minutes like a set of gluttons, and after having satisfied the immediate craving of the stomach, we gathered large quantities and laid them up in the boat. Upon attempting to get in again, we found ourselves so weak as to require each other's assistance. Indeed, had it not been for 3 of our crew who could not swim and who did not, therefore, get overboard, I know not by what means we should have been able to resume our situations in the boat. December 20th. About 7 o'clock, while we were sitting dispirited, silent, and dejected in our boats, one of our companions suddenly and loudly called out, "There's land!" We were all aroused in an instant as if electrified, and casting our eyes to leeward, there indeed was the blessed vision before us, as plain and palpable as could be wished for. It appeared at first a low white beach, and lay like a basking paradise before our longing eyes. It was discovered nearly at the same time by the other boats, and a general burst of joy and congratulations now passed between us. It was an island about 6 miles long and 3 broad, with a very high rugged shore, and surrounded by rocks. The sides of the mountains were bare, but on the tops it looked fresh and green with vegetation. Upon examining our navigators, we found it was the Ducey's Island. Having taken the musket and pistols, I with 3 others effected a landing upon some sunken rocks and waded thence to the shore. We now separated and went different directions in search of water. I had not proceeded far in my excursion before I discovered a fish about 1.5 feet in length swimming along in the water close to the shore. I commenced an attack upon him with the breech of my gun and struck him, and he ran under a small rock that lay near the shore, from whence I took him with the aid of my ramrod and brought him up upon the beach, and immediately fell to eating. My companions soon joined in the repast, and in less than 10 minutes the whole was consumed, bones and skin and scales, and all. With full stomachs, we imagined we could now attempt the mountains, where if in any part of the island we considered water would be most probably obtained. I accordingly clambered with excessive labor, suffering and pain, up amongst the bushes, roots, and underwood of one of the crags, looking in all directions in vain for every appearance of water that might present itself. There was no indication of the least moisture to be found. When I had got down, one of my companions informed me that he had found a place in a rock some distance off from which the water exuded in small drops, that he had, by applying his lips to the rock, obtained a few of them, which only served to whet his appetite. I immediately resolved to make a more thorough search the next day. We all returned again, and having hauled our boats up on the beach, laid down in them that night, free from all the anxieties of watching and labor, and amid all our sufferings, gave ourselves up to an unreserved forgetfulness and peace of mind. It was but a short space, however, until the morning broke upon us, and gnawing hunger and the raging fever of thirst then redoubled my wishes and efforts to explore the island again. We had still reserved our common allowance, but it was entirely inadequate for the purpose of supplying the raging demands of the palate, and such an excessive and cruel thirst was created as almost to deprive us of the power of speech. The lips became cracked and swollen, and a sort of gluttonous saliva collected in the mouth, disagreeable to the taste, and intolerable beyond expression. Our bodies had wasted away to almost skin and bone, and possessed so little strength as often to require each other's assistance in performing some of its weakest functions. Relief we now felt must come soon, or nature would sink. Our search for water again commenced with the morning, the small leaves of the shrubbery affording a temporary alleviation by being chewed in the mouth, and but for the peculiarly bitter taste which those of the island possessed, would have been an extremely grateful substitute. In the course of our rambles, too, along the sides of the mountain, we would now and then meet with tropic birds of a beautiful figure and plumage, occupying small holes, from which we plucked them without the least difficulty. Upon our approaching them, they made no attempts to fly, nor did they appear to notice us at all. We also found a plant, in taste not unlike peppergrass, growing in considerable abundance in the crevices of the rocks, and which provided to us a very agreeable food by being chewed with the meat of the birds. But water, the great object of all our anxieties and exertions, were nowhere to be found, and we began to despair of meeting with it on the island. Our state of extreme weakness prevented us from exploring any great distance. The whole day was thus consumed in picking up whatever had the least shape or quality of sustenance, and another night of misery was before us, to be passed without a drop of water to cool our parching tongues. In this state of affairs, we could not reconcile it with ourselves to remain longer at this place. A day, an hour, lost to us unnecessarily here might cost us our preservation. I addressed the substance of these few reflections to the captain, and after some considerable conversation on the subject, it was finally concluded to spend the succeeding day in the further search for water, and if none could be found, to quit the island the morning after. December 22nd. The dawn of day aroused us again to labor. My principal hope was founded upon my success in picking the rocks where the moisture had been discovered the day before. It was about a quarter of a mile from our encampment, and with 2 men I commenced my labors with a hatchet and an old chisel. The rock proved to be very soft, and in a very short time I had obtained a considerable hole. I watched it for some time with great anxiety, hoping that as I increased the depth of the hole, the water would presently flow. But all my hopes and efforts were unavailing, and at last I desisted from further labor and sat down near it in utter despair. As I turned my eyes towards the beach, I saw some of the men in the act of carrying a keg along from the boats, with an extraordinary spirit and activity. I quitted my seat in a moment, made the best of my way towards them with a palpitating heart, and they gave me the cheering news that they had found a spring of water. I felt at that moment as if I could have fallen down and thanked God for his act of mercy. When I arrived at the spot, I found my companions had all taken their fill, and with an extreme degree of forbearance, I then satisfied myself. Many had laid down and thoughtlessly swallowed large quantities of it until they could drink no more. Upon examining the place from whence we had obtained this miraculous and unexpected succor, we were equally astonished and delighted with the discovery. It was on the shore above which the sea flowed to the depth of near 6 feet, and we could procure the water from it only when the tide was down. The crevice from which it rose was in a flat rock, large surfaces of which were spread around and composed the face of the beach. We filled our 2 kegs before the tide rose and went back again to our boats. The remainder of this day was spent in seeking for fish, crabs, birds, and anything else that fell in our way that could contribute to satisfy our appetites. And we enjoyed during that night a most comfortable and delicious sleep, unattended with those violent cravings of hunger and thirst that had poisoned our slumbers for so many previous. We concluded to remain at least 4 or 5 days, within which time it could be sufficiently known whether it would be advisable to make any arrangements for a more permanent abode. December 23rd. Each man sought for his own daily living, on whatsoever the mountains, the shore, or the sea could furnish him with. And during our stay there, the whole time was employed in roving about for food. We found, however, on the 24th that we had picked up on the island everything that could be got at in the way of sustenance. Every accessible part of the island contiguous to us, or within reach of our weak enterprise, was already ransacked for birds' eggs and grass and was rifled of all that they contained. Our situation here, therefore, now became worse than it would have been in our boats on the ocean, because in the latter case we should still be making some progress towards the land. After much conversation amongst us on this subject, and again examining our navigators, it was finally concluded to set sail for Easter Island. It was nearer by 850 miles to the coast and could not be worse in its productions than the one we were about leaving. The 26th of December was wholly employed in preparations for our departure. Our boats were hauled down to the vicinity of the spring, and everything else that would contain it filled with water. There had been considerable talk between 3 of our companions about their remaining on this island, and taking their chance both for a living and an escape from it. And as the time drew near at which we were to leave, they made up their minds to stay behind. Should we, however, ever arrive safely, it would become our duty, and we so assured them, to give information of their situation and make every effort to procure their removal from thence. They had begun before we came away to construct a sort of habitation, composed of the branches of trees, and we left them with every little article that could be spared from the boats. The captain wrote letters to be left on the island, giving information of the fate of the ship and that of our own. These letters were put in a tin case enclosed in a small wooden box and nailed to a tree on the west side of the island near our landing place. We had observed some days previously the name of a ship, the Elizabeth, cut out in the bark of this tree, which rendered it indubitable that one of that name had once touched here. There was, however, no date to it. December 27th. I went before we set sail this morning and procured for each boat a flat stone and 2 armfuls of wood, with which to make a fire in our boats. We made all sail and steered around the island for the purpose of making a little further observation. Before we started, we missed our 3 companions and found they had not come down. I walked up the beach towards their rude dwelling and informed them that we were then about to set sail and should probably never see them more. They seemed to be very much affected, and one of them shed tears. They wished us to write to their relations should Providence safely direct us again to our homes, and said but little else. Finding them ill at heart about taking any leave of us, I hastily bid them goodbye, hoped they would do well, and came away. They followed me with their eyes until I was out of sight. On the northwest side of the island, we saw a number of sharks, but all efforts to take them proved ineffectual, and we got but a few small fish, which we divided amongst us. In this business, we were occupied for the remainder of the day until 6 o'clock in the afternoon, when the men, having returned to the shore from their search in the mountains, brought a few birds, and we again set sail and steered directly for Easter Island. On the 3rd of January, we experienced heavy squalls accompanied with dreadful thunder and lightning. We commenced from Ducey's Island to keep a regular reckoning. On the 4th of January, we found we had got to the southward of Easter Island. We should not be able to get on to the eastward so as to reach it. Our birds and fish were all now consumed, and we had begun again upon our short allowance of bread. It was necessary in this state of things to change our determination. We had but little hesitation in concluding, therefore, to steer for the island of Juan Fernandez, a distant 2,500 miles. January 10th. Matthew P. Joy, the second mate, had suffered from debility and the privations we had experienced much beyond any of the rest of us, and was on the 8th removed to the captain's boat. This day being calm, he manifested a desire to be taken back again, but at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, after having placed him back in his own boat, he died very suddenly. We sewed him up in his clothes and tied a large stone to his feet, and having brought all the boats to, consigned him in a solemn manner to the ocean. This man did not die of absolute starvation, although his end was no doubt very much hastened by his sufferings. He had a weak and sickly constitution and complained of being unwell the whole voyage. It was an incident, however, which threw a gloom over our feelings for many days. On the 12th of January, we had the wind. Flashes of lightning were quick and vivid, and the rain came down in cataracts. As the gale blew us fairly on our course, and our speed being great during the day, we derived, I may say, even pleasure from the uncomfortableness and fury of the storm. We were apprehensive that in the darkness of this night we should be separated, and made arrangements, each boat to keep a course, all night. About 11 o'clock, my boat being a short distance of the others, I turned my head back, as I was in the habit of doing every minute, and neither of the others were to be seen. It was blowing and raining at this time as if the heavens were separating, and I knew not hardly at the moment what to do. I lay drifting about an hour, expecting every moment that they should come up with me, but not seeing anything of them, I put away again and stood on the course agreed upon. When the morning dawned, in vain did we look over every part of the ocean for our companions. They were gone. The 14th of January proved another very squally and rainy day. We had now been 19 days from the island and had only made a distance of about 900 miles. Necessity began to whisper us that a still further reduction of our allowance must take place, or we must abandon altogether the hopes of reaching the island and rely wholly on the chance of being taken up by a vessel. But how to reduce the daily quantity of food, with any regard to life itself, was a question of the utmost consequence. We had a full allowance of water, but it only served to contribute to our debility, our bodies deriving but the scanty support which an ounce and a half of bread for each man afforded. We were as yet just able to move about in our boats, and slowly perform the necessary labors appertaining to her, but we were fast wasting away, and we daily almost perished under the torrid rays of a meridian sun, to escape which we would lie down in the bottom of the boat, cover ourselves with the sails, and abandon her to the mercy of the waves. I had laid down in the boat without taking the usual precaution of securing the lid of the provision chest, when one of the men awoke me, and informed me that one of the other men had taken some bread from it. I felt at that moment the highest indignation and resentment at such conduct in any of our crew, and immediately took my pistol in hand and charged him if he had taken any, to give it up without the least hesitation, or I should shoot him instantly. He became at once very much alarmed, and trembling confessed the fact, pleading the hard necessity that urged him to it. He appeared to be very penitent for his crime, and earnestly swore that he would never be guilty of it again. Every humane feeling of nature pled in his behalf, and he was permitted to escape with the solemn injunction that a repetition of the same offense would cost him his life. On the 15th of January at night, a very large shark was observed swimming about us in a most ravenous manner, making attempts every now and then upon different parts of the boat, as if he would devour the very wood with hunger. He came several times and snapped at the steering oar and even the stern post. We tried in vain to stab him with the lance, but we were so weak as not to be able to make any impression upon his hard skin. He was so much larger than an ordinary one and manifested such a fearless malignity as to make us afraid of him, and our utmost efforts, which were at first directed to kill him for prey, became in the end self-defense. Baffled, however, in all his hungry attempts upon us, he shortly made off. On the 16th of January, about 8 o'clock, the terrible noise of whale spouts near us sounded in our ears. We could distinctly hear the furious thrashing of their tails in the water, and our weak minds picked out their appalling and hideous aspects. One of my companions took an immediate fright and solicited me to take out the oars and endeavor to get away from them. I consented to his using any means for that purpose, but alas, it was wholly out of our power to raise a single arm in our own defense. 2 or 3 of the whales came near us and went swiftly across our stern, blowing and spouting at a terrible rate. However, after an hour or two, disappeared. January 20th. Richard Peterson manifested today symptoms of a speedy dissolution. He had been lying between the seats in the boat, utterly dispirited and broken down, and had this morning made up his mind to die rather than endure further misery. He refused his allowance, said he was sensible of this approaching end, and was perfectly ready to die. In a few minutes he became speechless. The breath appeared to be leaving his body without producing the least pain, and at 4 o'clock he was gone. I had 2 days previously conversations with him, and he begged me to let his wife know his fate, if ever I reached home in safety. The next morning we committed him to the sea. 24th of January. We were now in a most wretched and sinking state of debility, hardly able to crawl around the boat, and possessing but strength enough to convey our scanty morsels to our mouths. I felt many a despairing moment that day, that had well nigh proved fatal. Our ounce and a half of bread, which was to serve us all day, was in some cases greedily devoured, as if life was to continue but another moment. And at other times it was hoarded up and eaten crumb by crumb at regular intervals during the day, as if it would last us forever. To add to our calamities, biles began to break out upon us, and our imaginations shortly became as diseased as our bodies. I laid down at night to catch a few moments of oblivious sleep, and immediately my starving fancy was at work. I dreamt of being placed near a splendid and rich repast, where there was everything that the most dainty appetite could desire. And just as I was about to partake of it, I suddenly awoke to the cold realities of my miserable situation. Nothing could have oppressed me so much. 8th of February. Our sufferings were now drawing to a close. A terrible death appeared shortly to await us. Hunger became violent and outrageous, and we were prepared for a speedy release from our troubles. Our speech and reason were both considerably impaired, and we were reduced to be at this time certainly the most helpless and wretched of the whole human race. Isaac Cole, one of our crew, had the day before this, in a fit of despair, thrown himself down in the boat, and was determined there calmly to wait for death. It was obvious that he had no chance. All was dark, he said, in his mind. Not a single ray of hope was left for him to dwell upon, and it was folly and madness to be struggling against what appeared so palpably to be our fixed and settled destiny. I remonstrated with him as effectually as the weakness both of my body and understanding would allow of, and what I said appeared for a moment to have a considerable effect. He made a powerful and sudden effort, half rose up, crawled forward, and hoisted the jib, and firmly and loudly cried that he would not give up, that he would live as long as the rest of us. But alas, this effort was but the hectic fever of the moment, and he shortly again relapsed into a state of melancholy and despair. About 10 o'clock, we suddenly perceived that he became speechless. He lay in the greatest pain and apparent misery, groaning piteously until 4 o'clock, when he died in the most horrid and frightful convulsions I ever witnessed. We kept his corpse all night, and in the morning my 2 companions began, as of course, to make preparations to dispose of it in the sea. When after reflecting on the subject all night, I addressed them on the painful subject of keeping the body for food. Our provisions could not possibly last us beyond 3 days, within which time it was not in any degree probable that we should find relief from our present sufferings. It was without any objection agreed to, and we set to work as fast as we were able to prepare it as to prevent its spoiling. We separated his limbs from his body and cut all the flesh from the bones, after which we opened the body, took out the heart, and then sewed it up as decently as we could, and committed it to the sea. We first commenced to satisfy the immediate cravings of nature from the heart, which we eagerly devoured, and then ate sparingly of a few pieces of the flesh, after which we hung up the remainder, cut in thin strips about the boat to dry in the sun. In this manner did we dispose of our fellow sufferer, the painful recollection of which brings to mind at this moment some of the most disagreeable and revolting ideas that it is capable of conceiving. We knew not then to whose lot it would fall next, either to die or be shot, and eaten like the poor wretch we had just dispatched. humanity must shudder at the dreadful recital. I have no language to paint the anguish of our souls in this dreadful dilemma. 10th of February. About 3 o'clock this afternoon, a strong breeze set in from the northwest, and we made very good progress. We contrived to keep soul and body together by sparingly partaking of our flesh, cut up in small pieces and eaten with salt water. On the 15th, our flesh was all consumed, and we were driven to the last morsel of bread, consisting of 2 cakes. We were still, as near as we could judge, 300 miles from the land, and but 3 days of our allowance on hand. On the 17th, in the afternoon, a heavy cloud appeared to be settling down, which in my view indicated the vicinity of some land, which I took for the island of Masafuera. I concluded it could be no other, and immediately upon this reflection, the lifeblood began to flow again briskly in my veins. I told my companion I was well convinced it was land, and if so, in all probability, we should reach it before 2 days more. The next morning before daylight, Thomas Nicholson, a boy about 17 years of age, one of my 2 companions who had thus survived with me, laid down, drew a piece of canvas over him, and cried out that he wished to die immediately. I saw that he had given up, and I attempted to speak a few words of comfort and encouragement to him. But he felt unwilling to listen to any of the consolatory suggestions which I made to him. And notwithstanding the extreme probability which I stated there was of our gaining the land before the end of 2 days more, he insisted upon lying down and giving himself up to despair. At about 7 o'clock this morning, while I was lying asleep, my companion who was steering suddenly and loudly called out, "There's a sail!" I immediately stood up, gazing in a state of abstraction and ecstasy upon the blessed vision of a vessel about 7 miles off from us. She was standing in the same direction with us. I do not believe it is possible to form a just conception of the pure, strong feelings and the unmingled emotions of joy and gratitude that took possession of my mind on this occasion. The boy, too, took a sudden and animated start from his despondency and stood up to witness the probable instrument of his salvation. Our only fear now that she would not discover us, or that we might not be able to intercept her course. We, however, put our boat immediately, as well as we were able to, in a direction to cut her off, and found to our great joy that we sailed faster than she did. The captain hailed us and asked who we were. I told him we were from a wreck, and he cried out immediately for us to come up along his ship. I made an effort to assist myself along to the side, but my strength failed me altogether, and I found it impossible to move a step further without help. We must have formed at that moment, in the eyes of the captain and his crew, a most deplorable and affecting picture of suffering and misery. Our cadaverous countenances, sunken eyes and bones just starting through the skin with the ragged remnants of clothes stuck about our sunburnt bodies must have produced an appearance to him affecting and revolting in the highest degree. The sailors commenced to remove us from our boat, and we were taken to the cabin and comfortably provided for in every respect. In a few minutes, we were permitted to taste of a little thin food made from tapioca, and in a few days, we were considerably recruited. This vessel proved to be the brig Indian Captain William Crozier of London. At 12 o'clock this day, we saw the island of Masafuera, and on the 25th of February, we arrived at Valparaiso in utter distress and poverty. Our wants were promptly relieved there. The captain and the survivors of his boat's crew were taken up by the American whale ship, the Dauphine, and arrived at Valparaiso on the 17th of March. The 3rd boat got separated from him and has not been heard of since. The captain relates that after having been separated, they continued to make what progress they could toward the island of Juan Fernandez, as was agreed upon. On the 21st, the captain and his crew were in the like dreadful situation with respect to their provisions, and on the 23rd, Charles Shorter died, and his body was shared for food between the crews of both boats. On the 27th, Isaac Shepard died, and on the 28th, Samuel Reed died. The bodies of these men constituted their only food while it lasted. On the 1st of February, having consumed the last morsel, the captain and the 3 other men that remained with him were reduced to the necessities of casting lots. It fell upon Owen Coffin to die, who with great fortitude and resignation submitted to his fate. On the 11th, Brasilia Ray died, and on these 2 bodies the captain and Charles Ramsdale, the only 2 that were then left, subsisted until the morning of the 23rd, when they fell in with the ship Dauphine. On the 11th of June following, I arrived at Nantucket in the whale ship the Eagle. My family had received the most distressing account of our shipwreck and had given me up for lost. My unexpected appearance was welcomed with the most grateful obligations and acknowledgments to a most beneficent Creator, who had guided me through trouble, darkness, and death once more to the bosom of my country and my friends.